Moonlight upon earth so gently shines to make romantic a lover's smile. But the reality of the lunar night is cold beyond human belief. Cold and darkly silent. Grim desolation. Awesome. Majestic. A frowning majesty that even to the most intrepid human beholder is inconceivably forbidding. And there were humans here now. On this tumbled plain, between Archimedes and the mountains, one small crater amid the million of its fellows was distinguished this night by the presence of humans. The Grantline camp. It huddled in the deepest purple shadows on the side of a bowl-like pit, a crudely circular orifice with a scant 2 miles across its rippling rim. There was faint light here to mark the presence of the living intruders. The blue glow radiance of Morel tube lights under a spread of glassite. The Grantline camp stood midway up one of the inner cliff walls of the little crater. The broken, rock-strewn floor, 2 miles wide, lay 500 feet below the camp. Behind it, the jagged, precipitous cliff rose another 500 to the heights of the upper rim. A broad level shelf hung midway up the cliff, and upon it Grantline had built his little group of glassite dome shelters. Viewed from above there was the darkly purple crater floor, the upflung circular rim where the earthlight tinged the spires and crags with yellow sheen, and on the shelf, like a huddled group of birds' nests, Grantline's domes hung and gazed down upon the inner valley. The air here on the moon surface was negligible, a scant 1/5000th of the atmospheric pressure at the sea level on Earth. But within the glassite shelter, a normal Earth pressure must be maintained. Rigidly braced double walls to withstand the explosive tendency, with no external pressure to counteract it. A tremendous necessity for mechanical equipment had burdened Grantline's small ship to capacity. The chemistry of manufactured air, the pressure equalizers, renewers, respirators, the lighting and temperature maintenance of a spaceflyer was here. There was this main Grantline building, stretched low and rectangular along the front edge of the ledge. Within it were living rooms, mess hall, and kitchen. 50 feet behind it, connected by a narrow passage of glassite, was a similar though smaller structure. The mechanical control rooms, with their humming, vibrating mechanisms, were here. And an instrument room with signaling apparatus, senders, receivers, mirror grids, and audiphones of several varieties. And an electro-telescope, small but modern, with dome overhead like a little Earth observatory. From this instrument building, beside the connecting pedestrian passage, wire cables for light, and air tubes and strings and bundles of instrument wires ran to the main structure, gray snakes upon the porous, gray lunar rock. The third building seemed a lean-to banked against the cliff wall, a slanting shed wall of glassite 50 feet high and 200 in length. Under it, 4 months Grantline's bores had dug into the cliff. Braced tunnels were here, penetrating back and downward into the vein of rock. The work was over. The borers had been dismantled and packed away. At one end of the cliff the mining equipment lay piled in a litter. There was a heap of discarded or where Grantline had carted and dumped it after his first crude refining process had yielded it as waste. The ore slag lay like grey powder flakes strewn down the cliff. Trucks and or carts along the ledge stood discarded, mute evidence of the weeks and months of work these helmeted miners had undergone, struggling upon this airless, frowning world. But now all that was finished. The catalytic ore was sufficiently concentrated. It lay, this treasure, in a 70-foot pile behind the glassite lean-to, with a cage of wires over it and an insulation barrage hiding its presence. The ore shelter was dark, the other 2 buildings were lighted. And there were small lights mounted at intervals about the camp and along the edge of the ledge. A spider ladder, with tiny platforms some 20 feet one above the other, hung precariously to the cliff face. It descended the 500 feet to the crater floor, and, behind the camp, it mounted the jagged cliff face to the upper rim height, where a small observatory platform was placed. Such was the outer aspect of the Grantline treasure camp near the beginning of this lunar night, when, unknown to Grantline and his men, the plane Terra with its brigands was approaching. The night was perhaps a sixth advanced. Full night. No breath of cloud to mar the brilliant starry heavens. The quadrant Earth hung poised like a giant mellow moon over Grantline's crater. A bright Earth, yet no air was here on this lunar surface to spread its light. Only a glow, mingling with the spots of blue tube light on the poles along the cliff, and the radiance from the lighted buildings. No evidence of movement showed about the silent camp. Then a pressure door in an end of the main building opened its tiny series of locks. A bent figure came out. The lock closed. The figure straightened and gazed about the camp. Grotesque, bloated semblance of a man. Helmeted, with rounded dome hood, suggestion of an ancient sea diver, yet goggled and trunked like a gas-masked fighter of the 20th century. He stopped presently and disconnected metal weights which were upon his shoes. Then he stood erect again, and with giant strides bounded along the cliff. Fantastic figure in the blue-lit gloom. A child's dream of crags and rocks and strange lights with a single monstrous figure in 7-league boots. He went the length of the ledge with his 20-foot strides, inspected the lights, and made adjustments. Came back, and climbed with agile, bounding leaps up the spider ladder to the dome of the crater top. A light flashed on up there. Then it was extinguished. The goggled, bloated figure came leaping down after a moment. Grantline's exterior watchman making his rounds. He came back to the main building. Fastened the weights on his shoes. Signaled. The lock opened. The figure went inside. It was early evening. After the dinner hour and before the time of sleep according to the camp routine Grantline was maintaining. 9 p.m. of Earth Eastern American Time, recorded now upon his Earth chronometer. In the living room of the main building Johnny Grantline sat with a dozen of his men dispersed about the room, whiling away as best they could the lonesome hours. All as usual. This cursed moon. When I get home, if I ever do. Say your say, Wilkes. But you'll spend your share of the gold leaf and thank your constellations that you had your chance to make it. Let him alone. Come on, Wilkes, take a hand here. This game is not any good with 3. The man who had been outside flung his hissing helmet recklessly to the floor and unsealed his suit. Here, get me out of this. No, I won't play. I can't play your cursed game with nothing at stake. A laugh went up at the sharp look Johnny Grantline flung from where he sat reading in a corner of the room. Commander's orders. No gambling gold leafers tolerated here. Play the game, Wilkes, Grantline said quietly. We all know it's infernal, this doing nothing. He's been struck by Earthlight, another man laughed. Commander, I told you not to let that guy Wilkes out at night. A rough but good-natured lot of men. Jolly and raucous by nature in their leisure hours. But there was too much leisure here now. Their mirth had a hollow sound. In older times, explorers of the frozen polar zones had to cope with inactivity, loneliness, and despair. But at least they were on their native world. The grimness of the moon was eating into the courage of Grantline's men. An unreality here. A weirdness. These fantastic crags. The deadly silence. The nights, almost 2 weeks of Earth time in length, congealed by the deadly frigidity of space. The days of black sky, blazing stars and flaming sun, with no atmosphere to diffuse the sun's heat radiating so swiftly from the naked lunar surface that the outer temperature still was cold. And day and night, always the beloved Earth disk hanging poised up near the zenith. From thinnest crescent to full Earth, then back to crescent. All so abnormal, irrational, disturbing to human senses. With the mining work over, an irritability grew upon Grantline's men. And perhaps since the human mind is so wonderful, elusive a thing, there lay upon these men an indefinable sense of disaster. Johnny Grantline felt it. He thought about it now as he sat in the room corner watching Wilkes being forced into the Plaget game, and he found the premonition strong within him. Unreasonably, ominous depression. Barring the accident which had disabled his little spaceship when they reached the small crater hole, his expedition had gone well. His instruments, and the information he had from the former explorers, had enabled him to pick up the catalyst vein with only 1 month of search. The vein had now been exhausted, but the treasure was here enough to supply every need on his Earth. Nothing was left but to wait for the Planetara. The men were talking of that now. She ought to be well midway from Ferrokshon by now. When do you figure she'll be back here and signal us? 20 days. Give her another 5 now to Mars, and 5 in port. That's 10. We'll pick her signals in 3 weeks, mark me. 3 weeks. Just give me 3 weeks of reasonable sunrise and sunset. This cursed moon. You mean, Williams, next daylight. Ha! He's inventing a lunar language. You'll be a moon man yet. Olaf Swenson, the big blond fellow from the Scandiafjords, came and flung himself down beside Grantline. I tank they bane without enough to do, Commander. 3 weeks isn't very long, Ol. No. Maybe not. From across the room somebody was saying, if the comet hadn't smashed on us, damn me but I'd ask the commander to let some of us take her back. Shut up, Billy. She is smashed. You all agreed to things as they are, Johnny said shortly. We all took the same chances, voluntarily. A dynamic little fellow, this Johnny Grantline. Short of temper sometimes, but always just, and a perfect leader of men. In stature he was almost as small as Snap. But he was thick-set, with a smooth-shaven, keen-eyed, square-jawed face, and a shock of brown tousled hair. A man of 35, though the decision of his manner, the quiet dominance of his voice made him seem older. He stood up now, surveying the blue-lit glassite room with its low ceiling close overhead. He was bow-legged, in movement he seemed to roll with a stiff-legged gait like some sea captains of former days on the deck of his swaying ship. Odd-looking figure. Heavy flannel shirt and trousers, boots heavily weighted, and bulky metal-loaded belt strapped about his waist. He grinned at Swenson. When the time comes to divide this treasure, everyone will be happy, Yoel. The treasure was estimated to be the equivalent of 90 millions in gold leaf. 110 millions in the gross as it now stood, with 20 millions to be deducted by the federated refiners for reducing it to the standard purity for commercial use. 90 millions, with only $1.5 million to come off for expedition expenses, and the Planetara's share another $1 million. A nice little stake. Grantline strode across the room with his rolling gait. Cheer up, boys. Who's winning there? I say, you fellows. An audiphone buzzer interrupted him, a call from the duty man in the instrument room of the nearby building. Grantline clicked the receiver. The room fell into silence. Any call was unusual, nothing ever happened here in the camp. The duty man's voice sounded over the room. Signals coming. Not clear. Will you come over, Commander? Signals. It was never Grantline's way to enforce needless discipline. He offered no objection when every man in the camp rushed through the connecting passages. They crowded the instrument room where the tense duty man sat bending over his radio receivers. The mirrors were swaying. The duty man looked up and met Grantline's gaze. "I ran it up to the highest intensity, Commander. We ought to get it." "Low scale, Peter?" "Yes. Weakest infrared. I'm bringing it up, even though it uses too much of our power." "Get it," said Grantline shortly. "I got one slight television swing a minute ago, then it faded. I think it's the Plane Terra." Plane Terra. The crowding group of men chorused. How could it be the Plane Terra? But it was. The call came in presently. Unmistakably the Plane Terra, turned back now from her course to Ferrokshon. "How far away, Peter?" The duty man consulted the needles of his dial scale. "Close. Very weak infrared. But close. Around 30,000 miles, maybe. It's Snapdean calling." The Plane Terra here within 30,000 miles. Excitement and pleasure swept the room. The Plane Terra had for so long been awaited eagerly. The excitement communicated to Grantline. It was unlike him to be incautious, yet now with no thought save that some unforeseen and pleasing circumstance had brought the Plane Terra ahead of time. Incautious, Grantline certainly was. "Raise the barrage." "I'll go. My suit is here." A willing volunteer rushed out to the shed. "Can you send, Peter?" Grantline demanded. "Yes. With more power." "Use it." Johnny dictated the message of his location which we received. In his incautious excitement he ignored the secret code. An interval passed. No message had come from us, just Snap's routine signal in the weak infrared, which we hoped Grantline would not get. The men crowding Grantline's instrument room waited in tense silence. Then Grantline tried the television again. Its current weakened the lights with the drain upon the distributors, and cooled the room with a sudden deadly chill as the Arent's insulating system slowed down. The duty man looked frightened. "You'll bulge out our walls, Commander. The internal pressure." "We'll chance it." They picked up the image of the Plane Terra. It shone clear on the grid, the segment of star field with a tiny cigar-shaped blob. Clear enough to be unmistakable. The Plane Terra. Here now, over the moon, almost directly overhead, poised at what the altimeter scale showed to be a fraction under 30,000 miles. The men gazed in awed silence. The Plane Terra coming. But the altimeter needle was motionless. The Plane Terra was hanging poised. A sudden gasp went about the room. The men stood with whitening faces, gazing at the Planetaris image. And at the altimeter's needle. It was moving now. The Plane Terra was descending. But not with an orderly swoop. The grid showed the ship clearly. The bow tilted up, then dipped down. But then in a moment it swung up again. The ship turned partly over. Righted itself. Then swayed again, drunkenly. The watching men were stricken in horrified silence. The Planetaris image momentarily, horribly, grew larger. Swaying. Then turning completely over, rotating slowly end over end. The Plane Terra, out of control, was falling.